Welcome everyone to another installment of Coffee with Carl. Today I have Adam Abramowitz from Fisher Broyles. Welcome, Adam. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to do a new slant today and focus more specifically for clients on the estate planning process. Adam is an expert and partner in their private client group, so I thought he'd be an excellent resource for us. Adam, I know for many, the estate planning process can be quite difficult and quite challenging to even attack. Can you just walk through us for us at a high level, just what estate planning is?
Sure. And that's a good question to start off with. I think that a lot of people are scared off by the process because it seems doom and gloom to everyone to talk about estate planning. But for many of us, the lifetime planning piece is the majority of what an estate plan is comprised of. And I always like to look at it a little bit like a Venn diagram to help people visualize. So on the left side of your Venn diagram is kind of your lifetime planning piece that talks about dealing with incapacity planning and lifetime planning. If you're traveling, internationally and you need someone to sign off on something, or if you have an incapacity situation and you need someone to make medical decisions or financial decisions, pay your bills, those types of basic needs, they're covered on that left side. On the right side, you look at things that are post-death, more like your will or some trust planning to deal with post-death administration of assets, guardianship, those types of matters that happen when someone passes away. And then in the middle, there are certain aspects of trust planning that kind of span both sides of the lifetime and post-death planning piece. But the majority of all of that, you can look at it as the header of the whole chart, is the intentions of and goals of somebody going through it. And so the overarching theme is that an estate plan needs to be tailored and personalized to each individual. And so estate planning is what each individual makes of it. It can be a very narrow scope or it can be a very broad scope.
Yeah, how does one get started? What are some of the initial steps and what does that process look like when attacking or setting up one's estate plan?
That's a good question to start off the process. And oftentimes it starts with someone like yourself who has a quarterly review or a new client that comes in and you're looking at the whole picture of what their financial plan is going to be or what they're looking to accomplish. And on that checklist is usually what does your estate plan look like because it has a direct impact. And so when you're looking at those things, it's not just jumping right into, well, who do you want to make decisions on your behalf? A lot of it is preparing for that initial meeting. And that's the first step, which is identifying the scope. What are the assets that we're planning for? What is it that we own? What is it that we might acquire now or in the future? Looking at things like beneficiary designations, titling of assets. What do we own individually? What do we own jointly? What have we maybe inherited in a trust? All of those things go into a list. And then again, you go back to writing down what are your goals for the process. Some goals may be just to do what's necessary to care for a minor child if something happens. Some may be more expansive to doing tax planning, but whatever it is, they can be simple, they can be difficult, but it's listing what those goals are because, again, to have an effective plan, to get ready for it, you have to figure out what you want to accomplish. And then kind of the third piece of that is making a list of questions. What is it that you want to know about the process? What is it that you feel like is pushing you towards doing it? Is it that you had a loved one that maybe passed away and you had difficulties there? Are you having your first child and someone said to you, oh, you should have a will, you should have guardianship documents to make sure if something happens to you, that new baby is cared for. Whatever it may be, it's a lot of looking at what the who, what, when, where, and why is and making those questions. Once you can accomplish that, and oftentimes someone like myself will have a questionnaire that we send out to people to help them chart out those questions. But once you accomplish that, you're ready to have that meeting. And so working with someone like yourself or even an accountant, it's then partnering with those professionals to get to the next step of being in front of an attorney and being able to answer those questions. It's always about getting to that over the hump of having that meeting. There's no harm in having that meeting and at least asking your questions.
I feel like sometimes folks struggle with making these choices, as far as like beneficiaries and just where some of the assets go and some of the family members. How do you work with them or, provide kind of counsel in some of that, or just making them feel a little more comfortable? Because I know that tends to be one of the things that slows some folks down, outside of your initial remark of just thinking about death in general.
No, absolutely. And I think the blessing and the curse of this process is that there's not typically a right or wrong answer. There are a lot of different paths, there are a lot of different options, and it's really just, again, getting back to what do they want to accomplish. If you're talking through retirement accounts or life insurance, who do they want to receive these things, or why someone should receive these things? And it's just talking through what they want to accomplish with it. It's not for someone to come up with a list of rules that they have to follow and to say you must do this or you must do that. It's really just having a very practical conversation about what's the overall plan trying to accomplish? Perhaps this beneficiary designation of a retirement account maybe goes to a spouse for tax reasons, but maybe a life insurance policy needs to go to children or a third party or for business purposes for a buy sell, whatever it may be. It's talking through those different options. And typically, what I like to do is really have those conversations and lay out a bunch of different options so that the individual or individuals can make an informed decision, because that's really what it's about. And it may take two, three, four conversations. It's not always one meeting, all the answers magically appear, and then we have an estate plan done. And whatever your answer is on day one may change on day five. It may change 3 years later. And so anybody who's going into this process should not be scared away by thinking whatever they do on day one is set in stone for the most part and can't change it. Usually with an estate plan, at least at the basic level, it's an evolving set of documents that's going to live and breathe with the individuals that are doing them. And it's going to change with them as their lives change.
This uh this one comes up. I mean, what are estate planning tends to only be thought of for the wealthy. What are some reasons or why, everyone should be thinking about the estate planning process? And then, I think at that level too, a lot of families just think, hey, I need a will. Why should a family come to you to go through an estate planning process so they have all these different documents, and maybe just kind of walk through some of the pitfalls when they don't?
Sure. Um, for the basic level of who needs estate planning, the simple response is that everyone needs it. It is certainly thought of as a process that the wealthy go through to protect their assets from taxes. On the big screen will make you think that, or a lot of the literature, can skew that way. But if you really drill down to it, it's at its most basic level, all of us need it. If we're walking down the street and we trip and fall and we hit our head and we can't pay our bills for the next 30 years of our life, who's going to do that? We can put documents in place that allow our spouse, our child, our friend, our trusted advisor to step in immediately and pay our mortgage and do those things to help us. Because the alternative is we have to go through what's typically a costly and time-consuming court process to have a guardianship, either of the person or of the property or both. It just
How
depends.
long is that, Adam? Like, what is that usually like?
It
What
depends on your
area of area?
jurisdiction. I mean, it often depends on the jurisdiction, but it can take 6 months. It can take a year. It could be maybe on an emergency basis, but court systems are unpredictable, so sometimes it can take a while. But the goal of estate planning is to try to avoid needing a court to make those decisions or relying on statutes to map that out for somebody. It's every individual's ability to be their own boss and make their own decisions. So on the basic level, everybody needs estate planning. There's not a one size fits all. Everybody's going to need it. Um, and then, as they go through the process, it could get more complicated over time. But again, they should go back to let's get the basics, in place. Again, as I said earlier, it could be because you had a loved one that passed away, and maybe you had a horrible experience going through the probate process in a jurisdiction to administer an estate. We often see people that have just gone through that. We often see people who are having a child, whether it's a first child or a second child. But we have plenty of people that come in and they're 65 years old and they've never done estate planning. And what I always tell them is we're not going to focus on the past and we're not going to blame why we didn't do it. We're just going to look forward and try to figure out how we figure this all out. And so there are so many different circumstances that can trigger somebody coming in. And I think that this time of year is often a time where we see people who aren't having one of those triggering events. They're just going through, putting their taxes together. They talk with their accountant, begin first quarter of the year, they're talking with their financial advisor to set up their budget or their planning for the year. And these topics come up. And I know we'll get to it later, but a lot of this process too is putting together the right team to look to, which is a team of professionals like an accountant, like yourself as an advisor, and as an attorney, so that if something happens, somebody has a list of people they can call. Or if there's higher level planning, you have people that can brainstorm what are the best strategies to accomplish your goals. And so all of that goes into this process, and everybody needs to have the conversation.
You mentioned avoiding the probate process. What are some basic tools that one would enact to do that? And
Sure.
maybe just walk through how I should potentially own assets at a basic level.
So with the caveat that everybody's going to be a little bit different in terms of how the owning of assets and all of that matches the intentions of the plan. In any jurisdiction, when you own assets in your sole name at death, if they do not have a beneficiary designation, if it's not a joint account or anything like that. So for example, I own a bank account. There is a process called the probate process that you're going to have to go through with the court, with your local register of wills, whatever it may be, to administer those assets. And that typically starts with filing a will and having a fiduciary appointed called an executor or personal representative. And it can be a long process, it can be a short process. It just depends on what the assets are. But it is something that the court's going to control. In order to avoid something like that, oftentimes, we will use either beneficiary designations. Many of you that have life insurance have a beneficiary, retirement accounts have a beneficiary. Those will pass directly to an individual. Things like a trust, for example, isn't a will substitute. It is an alternative to allow people to have assets that they transfer into a trust or that the trust owns, and those will avoid the probate process. All of this is to help with making administration easier. And one of the pros of that is the administration is a private process when you go through it outside of the probate side of things. When you're going through the probate process, it's public record. And so if you're someone that's private, if you're a celebrity or somebody like that, and you don't want the world knowing what your assets are and maybe what planning you did or didn't do, you want to think about that as you're going through your planning.
So let's talk about what the estate tax is. At the basic level, obviously, we think about just having the basic plan in place to avoid probate. So for those that are potentially in the estate tax category, can you walk through what the estate tax is currently? And then I know there's some potential changes coming down. Just walk through, what that may look like and to your best of judgment.
Sure. Um, Again, jurisdiction specific on the state level, but there is a tax component when individuals pass away, if we look at it kind of from the back end and come forward. And on the federal level, the current estate tax exemption, meaning you can own assets up to a certain level before you have to either incur or file a tax return, is approximately $13.9 million right now per person. And that has been going up and up and up, indexed for inflation as we've gone on here. But per the current tax laws, at the end of this year, that's going to sunset. And it's going to sunset back to levels that were significantly less. And it's going to be approximately $5 million per person, index for inflation, which everybody is predicting roughly to be about $7 million per person. And what that all means is that if you own assets of $10 million, for example, and this estate tax drops, then you will have to file a federal estate tax return upon death, meaning you may not owe tax, but you have at least met a threshold where you have to file a tax return. On certain state levels, depending where you live, there are state level estate tax exemptions as well. So I'm located in Maryland. There is a $5 million estate tax exemption in Maryland. Certain other places, DC has one that's in the approximately mid-4 range in terms of estate tax exemptions, and elsewhere A lot of them are on the East Coast, ironically, but there are other state exemptions as well. And what that all means is you have to look at what the level of assets are at the end of the day, and there could be one or more estate tax returns that have to be filed and potentially large tax ramifications that could be imposed or incurred. There are techniques that can be used to avoid certain things, that move assets from your ownership out of the estate for those who are above those thresholds. Everyone's going to want to meet with their advisors to talk through all of those options. But at its basic level, there is a federal exemption, there are certain state exemptions, and they require filing thresholds at a minimum if you meet those upon death. There are also what we call gift exemptions. There is also a federal gift tax as we kind of go through this process, and there's two levels of that as well. Currently, there is a federal lifetime exemption, which coincides with the estate tax exemption. And then there's an annual exclusion, which often goes up a little bit each year. Right now, I can give anybody $19,000 and I don't have a tax ramification to that. As a couple, you can give $38,000 to each individual. And so that allows gifting, if you have a pattern of giving to a child or a third party or whatever it is, it allows that without a tax filing threshold, each time you give a gift.
Yeah, that's a good point because for, let's say, husband, wife, they have a child, they could give that 38,000 per year. You could create a gift tax strategy where you would not be using any of your lifetime exemption, and start through that process. Adam, is there any benefit to starting to have these conversations this year while the exemption's a bit higher versus more the unknown, call it next year?
There's certainly a benefit. It's certainly, if you haven't started having that conversation yet, you should have that conversation depending on, your asset level. There are certain techniques still, even though, we're getting closer to the end of the year. It may not seem that way, but it's 9 months, and some days away. And some of these techniques can take a while to implement. But there are still certainly techniques people can use, whether it's using annual exclusion gifting,
Mhm.
whether it's starting to get more complicated and using certain trusts to gift assets or certain sales of assets. But it all goes along with the same original conversation in looking at what your assets are and how they're owned, and then talking through that with your advisors, whether they're legal advisors or financial advisors, to figure out what the plan is, because we can talk all these high level strategies and theory, and I'm sure even people listening to this are probably have their head spinning of what is he talking about? This is 5 million and 7 million and 9 million, whatever is going on here. But the reality of it is it's not for everybody. Taxes are not always number one on everybody's list. And so you have to always keep in the back of your mind, what is it that I want to accomplish? If tax savings is certainly up there, absolutely should have the conversation. You should have the conversation anyway. But for some, there may be a different threshold of what they feel like they want to give up in terms of control over their estate to accomplish tax savings versus, hey, I still want to control this for the benefit of my children because things may change, or I want to be charitably inclined at the end of the day, and maybe because I'm charitably inclined, I may not have an estate tax because it's a credit against it. Or maybe I have some family dynamics that are iffy and I don't know if I feel comfortable giving away something irrevocably to a child, or things of that nature. And so it is an ongoing conversation that should start now, especially with the tax laws the way they are. They could change. We've all seen the certain budget proposals. We know there's a discussions on a tax proposal that should be upcoming soon. There is a possibility that they extend the current tax laws, and so we won't sunset at the end of the year, which for those that have assets that meet that threshold will help them plan accordingly.
Yep.
But there's also a possibility that they can't come to an agreement and it does sunset and maybe there's no change. And so at a minimum, you should be able to make an informed decision as to what you do before year end.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, folks. So I wanted Adam to be on the broadcast today just so you guys get a better understanding of what the basic level of the process is and understand that there's a lot of nuances. And that's where myself, Adam, your CPA all work together to figure out where your net worth is today, if there's a net worth situation. How are some of the basic techniques that we can deploy to potentially lower or take advantage of some of the benefits that we have today? For some business owners that will see this video, you may have an asset that could appreciate dramatically over the next few years. Maybe you hit a contract and your business doubles. Well, right now we have very favorable tax laws, so you could potentially look at some framework around where you could benefit from that today. So I think it's really important to have a team, and that doesn't matter whether you're just getting started and you have a young family and you're building wealth, or you're more established and you're in a situation where you're thinking about estate taxes. I think it's very important to incorporate folks like Adam as a resource. Adam has been a partner of mine for a long time. Certainly, I'd be glad to make an introduction to him. But regardless of whether Adam, I think it's very important for each and every one of you guys to go through that due diligence process. Meet with an estate planner to find out find somebody that you're comfortable with, because you want to have that long-term partnership. Whether it's, planning for today or 40 years from now, I think that's one of the most important things. Adam, as we finish up, any big pitfalls or problem child issues that you've come across, in your years of practice that, people should try to plan against?
Yes.
Give you a softball, but yes.
I think that there are a number of pitfalls that we run across on a daily basis, just like any individual would, and a lot of them are basic things that people look at, whether it's family dynamics, and that's a loaded conversation of whether kids get along, family members get along. One of the worst things that you can hear in a conversation that I'm having with a family is, oh yeah, my kids get along, like siblings do, they fight a little bit. That's a major red flag to me, because then they tell you, okay, well, I want to name them jointly to make all the decisions. And then it's a recipe for ending up in court and ending up in issues that could occur. And so family dynamics is certainly one. I think certain more focused things like incapacity issues, special needs issues, people have to make sure that they understand that if they have individuals who are impacted in certain ways, that they have to write down in their documents how those assets for individuals like that should be treated. Because you could, if someone is receiving public benefits, for example, and you just say, I just want everything to be equally split and go outright and do all of these things that are just very basic, and you don't take the care needed to put those assets in the right trust, then that individual, not maliciously, could lose all of their public benefits from a government or however they're receiving them. And it's completely unintentional, but it's also completely avoidable with the right planning. I think another big issue nowadays is we're in a world where everybody likes to go on the internet and do things themselves. And I do not deter people from doing that. I understand people are busy, and a lot of people are very knowledgeable and can use tools on the internet to help with certain things. But when you go to an individual to do planning who is versed and trained in doing the planning, it is personalized for you. Using a product, I just caution, can have its own pitfalls. We have litigated many cases where there are blanks in documents, or a document has 70 pages of comprehensive planning that mean nothing to what the client who signed it, did, or they say that they were done in a different jurisdiction. So you have to, the first rule of all of this is you have to read the documents. You have to make sure that if you do any sort of planning like that, that it actually says what you think it says, and that you actually completed it fully. Because the last thing you want to do is do a plan that's going to get unwound or is not going to work the way you think it does. And so those are some of the common things that we see. But issues are getting much more complex as the years go on, and we're always surprised at certain things we see. But just you have to, in the world we live in, you have to be very careful of every step you're taking, because things, you can click a box the wrong way and choose the wrong beneficiary on an account. You can fill out a document wrong. And so you just have to make sure you're doing your due diligence and reviewing it over time after you sign it.
How often, that's a great closing point. How often should one review their estate plan?
So I tell clients every year they should at least open the PDF on the computer or take out their documents and flip through them and make sure the people that they have making decisions are still alive. Or let's say they put their parents as guardians, maybe their parents are aging. Are they still capable? Like very, very simple things. You know, families are still getting along. Those basic things. Every couple of years, we typically send out a letter to clients to say, hey, it's been a couple of years. You know, if we haven't heard from them, you should take a look at your documents in a more thorough way. And, you know, that gives them the ability to, again, assess, you know, maybe they sold a business in the last couple of years and they had a big liquidation event, and maybe there's additional planning or things of that nature. Other times that people should think about it is big triggering events in your life. Again, a death in the family, a new child, moving jurisdictions. You know, maybe I move from Maryland to Florida. There's different rules. You should think about going to a local attorney and updating those documents, things of that nature.
Thank you, Adam. This has been really, really helpful. So folks, if you guys do have any questions, I'm sure you will. The point of today's interview was just to give you guys some general knowledge, just to scratch the surface. So if you guys have any further questions, feel free to connect with me. I'm glad to make an introduction to Adam. But most importantly, coordinate with your team. I think that's the biggest takeaway. Make sure you have these different partners in place. That way you can have a cohesive planning team and ultimately be most successful in not only growing assets, but ultimately passing it with the most success. So Adam, thanks for joining us today. And thanks everyone for watching us. Appreciate it.